from GemServe, but just before we kick off, I just wanted to cover a couple of housekeeping pieces before we start. If you could please mute your microphones to limit disruption throughout the session, that would be fantastic. And if you aren't speaking, if you could just turn your microphone, your webcam off, and that will really help with video quality. And feel free to share your camera if you're asking a particular question. If you have any questions for the team, we have a Q&A function. So on the top of your screen, you will see two little speech bubbles. If you use that to ask a question, we will be taking questions throughout today. So if we go over to the next slide, in terms of our agenda, we'll give you a quick introduction to HNES for those of you that this is your first session that you're coming along to today. Then Sam will talk through the application process, and we will explain how your applications will be assessed. And then I will talk a little bit about the support that's available from the team. And as I say, there will be opportunities to ask questions throughout, but we'll do a wrap-up Q&A session at the end.
Right, so thank you very much, Sam. So my name is Louise Singleton. I'm the HNES Programme Manager at GemServe, and I'm going to give you a quick overview to HNES. Apologies to those people that may have seen some of this before, but hopefully this is a good refresher. So the HNES delivery partner is made up of 4 organisations. GemServe is the overall delivery partner manager, and we're responsible for the overall scheme delivery, the application management, monitoring, reporting, and comms and events like this one. We are working with Ramboll, who are our technical assessment partners. We worked with them as part of the HNES demonstrator that you might have been aware of that ran last year, and as part of that we supported 110 projects to claim over £5 million of grant funding. So we have partnered again for this scheme, and we've also then been joined by Turner and Townsend, who are providing pre-application support. So before you submit your application, you can engage with them and they can provide you with some guidance on what's required within the application form and give sort of help with your specific project, and we can talk more about that later on. And we have LuxNova partners who are there to provide legal advice, particularly around things like the grant funding agreements when we get to actually funding projects. So for the scheme itself, there are 3 aims and objectives. The first one is to reduce carbon emissions by making heat networks more efficient. The second one is to reduce customer detriment to improve consumer confidence. And the third one is to help the heat network market prepare for sector regulation and technical standards. So while obviously all 3 of them are important, the second one in particular really is something that we are focusing on more now than we did in the demo, particularly because of the cost of living crisis that we're in, and the impact that can have on consumers and their bills. So that is something we're really looking to support. The first 2, I guess, are things that particularly applicants can demonstrate in their application forms and with their projects. The third one is somewhat more within the department itself in terms of regulation is coming forward. The technical standards are being developed through the Heat Network Technical Assurance Scheme. So really working closely with them to make sure that we're supporting existing heat networks to improve their efficiency ahead of these standards coming in, and understanding where the market's at currently to help inform these standards. In terms of the funding itself, so there are 2 pots of funding. We've got capital grants and revenue grants. Capital grants are for actual sort of physical improvements to the heat network. These are part funded, and I cannot stress highly enough, up to but not including 50%. I will repeat this throughout today. Please do not submit an application form where you're requesting 50% or more of your capital grant funding. We will come back to you immediately and ask you to lower it. It has to be up to, but not including 50%. And that's for, like I said, the delivery and installation of energy or efficiency improvements to the heat network. And the budget for that is up to £30 million across the 2 financial years, 23-24 and 24-25. For revenue grants, these are for consultants essentially to come in and look at your heat network, understand where your heat network is poorly performing, and provide you with recommendations as to what would need to change to improve it. So that's kind of, I guess, at the beginning of the journey for people who know they have a poorly performing network but don't know why, and want some expertise to come in and really take a look under the bonnet and try and understand what improvements could be made. And for that, it's £2 million across the 2 financial years. It's worth noting that, I guess, particularly for capital projects at this stage, more than revenue projects, you can apply for funding across both financial years, but you have to spend the money you're allocated within each financial year within that financial year. So if you requested some money in the first financial year, you didn't spend it all, you wouldn't be able to roll that over to the next financial year. You would essentially lose that money, and you'd have to then find that yourselves. So it's really important to make sure when you're putting your projects together and you've got your project plans, you understand when you expect things to form within which financial year they will align to. In terms of who can apply, so we need the applicant to be an operator of an existing district heating network or communal heating system. So HNES is designed to improve existing heat networks. We are not there to support the development of new heat networks. For that, you'd probably want to look for the Green Heat Network Fund if you're in England. So that wouldn't be us. HNES covers England and Wales, so any heat networks that are in either of those countries would be eligible. Applicants can be from the public sector, private sector, or third sector organisations. That includes universities, NHS trusts, government departments, or local authorities, private organisations, housing associations. So a wide range of organisations are eligible. And the applicant must be a legal entity and have authority to sign off on the investment decisions for the heat network they are responsible for. So we need the applicant, when they apply, to make sure that they are using their full legal name, and that they do have ownership of that network in order to make decisions. So they don't necessarily need to be the ultimate owner. They could be the managing organisation, provided they do have that investment level sign off that they can make those decisions. So in terms of funding rounds, so the scheme launched in February. Our first funding round closed at the end of March. So we're now looking at funding round 2 and beyond. So the key date for funding round 2 is Friday the 19th of May. So a few weeks time from now. So yeah, that's when you would need to submit your applications into us for funding round 2, or the 7th of July if you're looking a little bit further ahead for funding round 3. Okay, so in terms of eligibility criteria, as I said, there's capital and revenue grants. So a capital grant can cover 4 categories. We've got the energy centre and the plant room. We've got the primary and secondary distribution network, the tertiary network, and metering. So I haven't gone into too much detail on this slide in terms of what is eligible. I'll point you towards our guidance for applicants document, which can be found on the gov.uk website. I'm sure we can put a link to it in the chat for this session. But that has a much more detailed breakdown of the different types of things that would be eligible under each of those categories. But I wanted to draw your attention to what isn't eligible under capital grants. So anything that you've already done prior to submitting your application for HNES wouldn't be included, because obviously that cost has already been spent. Anything that's not related to the heat network infrastructure itself wouldn't be included, and any costs relating to engagement activities, so stakeholder management, for example. Specifically within the energy centre, we would not be looking to replace the primary heat generation source. That, again, for those heat networks that are in England, would fall under GHNF. That's not what this scheme is designed to do. And in terms of tertiary systems, we wouldn't be looking at replacing radiators, for example, within a dwelling, or any other kind of heat emitters. So yeah, that won't be included. And then finally, for metering, obviously there is a legal requirement under the heat network metering and billing regulations for metering. So anything that would fall under that wouldn't be included, but we might be able to support additional metering requirements that go above and beyond those requirements, for example. In terms of revenue grants, so like I say, the output of a revenue grant is an optimization study. And within our guidance for applicants document, we do have a Annex A, which details out what the scope and the sort of specification of that study should look like. But essentially, we would be looking for a consultant to come in, understand how your network is currently performing, visit the site, make sure they've actually been there in person and seen it operating, capture any data, analyze any data that you have. We appreciate that, particularly for many older heat networks, one of the reasons why people don't know what is going wrong with the system is because they don't have the data to provide that. So we're not expecting projects necessarily to come forward with full, complete data sets, but anything that you do have is obviously useful. Obviously, then undertake an investigation of the network performance and identify areas of weakness, and produce a range of sort of measures or packages of measures that could be implemented to make improvements and to actually quantify the improvements that these could make. Provide cost of implementing these, and sort of the cost versus the benefits of these measures. And finally, produce a kind of short list of recommended measures that would be worthwhile implementing. And then finally, I kind of guess in a kind of a summary of this, there is an optimization study outputs annex that we would require revenue projects to complete at the end of the study, or I guess summarizing everything that's come out of the optimization study itself. In terms of ineligible costs, again, any work that's already been commissioned before the HNES grant has been awarded, any internal project management costs wouldn't be covered, and anything related to construction, operation, or maintenance of a heat network. Again, this is more of a exploratory study rather than actually running the heat network or making the improvements that a capital grant would essentially pay for. If you're successful in being awarded funding under HNES, you will be required to submit monitoring and reporting returns on a regular basis. These are really, really important to us. Firstly, to make sure that your projects remain on track, that you're delivering what you said you were going to deliver in your application, that the funding will be drawn down in a timely manner and within the financial year that it was awarded. And also particularly from a department perspective, making sure that the aims of the scheme are met. One of the things that was really, really vital in securing the funding for this scheme was the M&R evidence that we were able to provide from the demonstrator, which could show the real impact that the funding had and the improvements that it was making to the heat networks. So having this evidence is really, really valuable to make sure that the public money is being spent in the way that it should be. For revenue projects, you're required to complete M&R returns from the moment you're awarded grant funding until you've completed your optimization study and it's been signed off by ourselves and the department. For a capital perspective, it's from grant award until 24 months after your commissioning date. So it's for however long it takes you to implement all your measures that you've got the funding for, plus then 24 months after that. And the reason for that is that it means that we will have 2 years worth of data. So we've got 2 heating cycles to really see the improvements that the changes have made. On a monthly basis, both revenue and capital projects will need to provide updates on their project, how it's progressing, any risks and issues, and how you have drawn down and intend to draw down your budget or your grant that's been awarded to you. From a revenues return, the final return will need to include the optimization study outputs annex that I mentioned previously. And on a quarterly basis for a capital project, we will need an update on your progress against the benefits that you put in your application form, to make sure again that you're on track with those. Once you've commissioned your project, the monthly returns bit will drop away a bit more, and it will mainly be a focus on that quarterly returns in terms of how your project is meeting the benefits that you set out in your application form. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. I've seen there's been some questions in the Q&A, but if anyone's got any questions, if you want to take yourself off mute and raise your hands, then we can answer them now.
So we haven't had any specific questions come through on the Q&A. There was one within the chat around schemes in Scotland. So I've sent through a little bit of information there. However, I'm happy to check with colleagues within HNES to see if there's anything that we can point you towards. Does anybody have any questions so far? Nope. Okay, thanks, Louise.
Okay, perfect. That's all right.
John, apologies.
Yes, hi, John Sweeney from the Eton Borough Council. Could you just go back to maybe the 3rd slide, I think?
Gosh, yes. What did it have on it?
I'll tell you next. Sorry, next. The one where it's got the eligibility list, this one.
Yes.
There just seems some conflict between category 1 and in the ineligible costs for energy centre plant room. So so if we upgrade a plant room to a more energy efficient system, is that part of category 1?
Yeah, so the only thing that we've got here in terms of that wouldn't be eligible within the energy centre is to completely replace the heat source. That wouldn't be included. But if you were looking at, for example, improving insulation or replacing pipe work, things like that, that would be included within category 1.
So you mean it's not about boiler replacements for moving to modern systems?
Yeah, not. I think partly, like I say, partly that's because some of that would fall under GHNF, but also if you've got a particularly inefficient heat network, then at this stage you might not be it might not work to move to, say, low carbon alternatives at this stage. You'd actually want to do the improvements to make it more efficient first, and then look at replacement boilers at that stage. But I saw Georgia's got her hand up. She's from Ramble, and she might be able to provide a bit more detail on that.
Yeah, just that, for example, if you're looking to electrification from what you have already there, we're not able to support the cost of the replacing the boilers and putting the heat pumps, for example, instead, but we are able to support the enabling works around it. So if you need to change your controls, for example, to allow that change to happen, we can, you can ask that it's an eligible cost under category 1. Hope that helps a bit.
Yes, I understand. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Right. Any other questions, or shall we move on to the next section?
We've just had another question come through. Could we explain the difference between category 4 of eligible in relation to ineligible, so around metering?
Okay, so so within metering there are legal requirements that you have to meet. We wouldn't fund anything that is a legal requirement simply because it's a legal requirement and you should be doing it anyway, and so it's not a good use of public funds. However, if there was something, like I say, that's kind of above and beyond the requirements for metering that are set out in the metering and billing regulations, then potentially that is something that we could look to fund. If it gives you more data or a better understanding of your performance of your heat network, that could be something that that would be beneficial. So as long as it's not solely a legal requirement, then that's something we could consider.
Thanks, Louise. And we also had a question around whether it's more favourable to group several separate projects under one application or submit them as individual applications.
I think in that instance it would depend on the project. I think there is no harm in submitting several into one application, particularly if there are economies of scale, for example, that you can leverage. So actually, by submitting one application across 4 elements of a project, you might get project management savings, you might get benefits that might accrue because you're doing the 2 or 4 things together. But equally, we wouldn't penalize you for separating them out either. So so for example, if you had 4 projects that you wanted to do in sort of in sequence, and you are clearer on the costs for the first project and the time frames for delivery of the first project, but the 4th one is a little bit less clear because it's just later on, it might be better to hold off on that one until you've got a better clarity in terms of things like costs and timescales, to make us more confident in the delivery of that, I guess.
Thanks, Louise. I think we've got somebody with their hand up as well. Richard, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you've got a really large heat network with lots of different buildings on it, can each sort of building be submitted? I mean, if they're big buildings in their own rights as projects individually, like if it was a whole city sort of size, would you cover the city under one application or go building by building?
I think for that, it would depend on the project. We have got projects that do look quite large scale, I guess. And I guess it also depends on what improvements you'd be looking to make as well. Again, we have had people that have broken elements down just because that's they want to do it sequentially, and it makes sense to do so. But we wouldn't necessarily again suggest that that's necessarily the best option. It would depend on the project. What I probably will say, and it's maybe stealing Sam's thunder a little bit from later, is that we do have a relationship manager service that Turner and Townsend provide, and it might be worth speaking to them if you have specific projects to understand particularly your scenario, what measures you're looking to implement, the size of the network, how it will be divided up, because each project's different, and I wouldn't like to say one is right or the other's right at this stage without knowing more about the project. So I think that's probably the best option, but we wouldn't necessarily turn away a project that's looking to improve the whole network if it was going to deliver on our aims of the scheme.
Great, thanks.
No worries. I can see there's another question in here in the chat about the is there approved list of consultants who can provide the optimization study? No, there's not. We don't have a list of approved consultants. So what we would like to see as part of revenue applications is that people have gone out and at least started a bit of a procurement exercise, got an idea of the consultant or a couple of quotes from different consultants that they'd like to use, so we can see that it's the costs that they might have quotes, for example, from consultants. So yeah, we wouldn't necessarily have, it's not prescribed which consultants you go for under a revenue study.
Thanks, Louise. We've just got one more as well from John. John, I was wondering whether you could potentially elaborate on your question. I know you've asked us to elaborate. You've asked about, you said there are many exclusions in the capital grant conditions. So you're wondering what would be allowed. I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit on your question there.
Yes, sorry, I think it may have been answered by a question asked by another John, but I just see categories 1 to 4, but it doesn't tell me, what type of work, would be applicable for this grant, because we've got an existing network serving a quite large campus. We have existing boilers which we're looking to change for more efficient boilers, doing work with the central pumping system. And the controls, but what type of work could possibly be applicable for this funding source?
So again, this slide is more for brevity, I guess, than anything else. If you go to the guidance for applicants document, which I believe there is a link to at the beginning of the chat, it does give you a lot more detail in terms of what would be eligible. But like I say, we've things like replacement pipe work, improvements to insulation, replacement HRUs, so heat interface units, a number of different elements within each of the different sections. Controls, for example, would be eligible. So I'd advise you to have a look at that document. It does give you a lot more detail than I was able to put on the slide, basically.
John, who asked the first question, so I read it as that if we do like a energy centre plant room refurbishment, the heat source isn't applicable, but all the associations are, from pipe work to insulation to BMS to any sort of controls.
Yeah.
So we could subtract the heat source element, the boilers themselves, and bid in for the holistic plant area outside of the boilers. That's as I read it.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and it plays back to what Georgia said as well in terms of enabling works as well around replacement boilers. So,
Yes.
so yeah, it's. I think that's why I've particularly pulled out ineligible costs. That is one thing that is excluded within the energy centre, but everything else kind of around it would be eligible potentially.
And you can apply for a capital grant and a consultancy viewing one.
A revenue one as well. If you, I mean, you can. The revenue studies are predominantly there for people that don't know what's wrong with their heat network. Like I say, they know that it's not performing well, but they're not quite sure what the issues are. It might be that you already have identified one particular thing and you want a capital grant for that, but then you want the revenue study to look at other elements of the heat network, for example. So yeah, so that would be possible to do.
Yeah, great stuff. Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you. Toby, did you have a question as well? And we'll take that one and then we'll move on.
Yeah, please. If I could just it was just following up on an earlier question asked by somebody else regarding a list of consultants to assist with the optimization studies. From my understanding, that's part of the delivery or part of the HNES or mini competition scope of works that was, I guess tender for that one closed a while ago. I think there was six companies that were taken forward to work on that framework with the Department for Energy, of which Pinnacle Power were on there. So I think it was just putting a hand up to say that I think there should be some consultants available for that.
Yeah, so HNES2, so it's the Heat Network Optimization Opportunity Scheme that's run through the department's Heat Network Delivery Unit. That is more, so it is to provide optimization studies, but it's more for those people or those organizations that for whatever reason can't access HNES. So it might be that the timings don't work quite right, or there are reasons why HNES wouldn't be particularly right for the organisation, and within that, then HNDU would appoint one of their already approved consultants to work with that particular organisation. That doesn't apply to HNES. That's only for HNU2. So within HNES, as long as you've got you can demonstrate that you've which consultant you're hoping to go for, and we can see that they have experience in this area and that kind of thing, then we're happy to go with whoever the applicant comes forward with.
Okay, so I guess, is it worth, so for those that are looking for consultants to assist them in the optimization study and try and assess the data and do the proposal for the potential remediation works, is that something that I guess those that are on the call, you'd be able to direct them through to those that were successful on the mini competition or HNU?
I mean, I'm not sure what obviously that was a separate scheme. So again, I don't know what the sort of procurement process was that those people went through. If obviously these people have gone through a procurement process, but like I say, they're not the only organisations that you can use in HNES. So I wouldn't want to disadvantage other people that aren't on HNU2 because it's a separate scheme. But yeah, that is information that's out there for people.
Great, thanks, Louise.
Okay, no worries. Conscious of time, I think it's probably worth us moving on because we've only gone through the first part of the webinar. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sam Hales, who's going to talk you through the application process itself.
Thank you. Yeah, so I am Sam Hales at GemServe, sort of applicant support and relationship manager lead. So on the next slide, we've got a little bit about the application form. So there is this sort of status page that's on the application form, and it gives you a very easy sort of overview of what tabs are complete or incomplete and if the whole workbook is complete. And there are 6 tabs for all projects to complete. There are different forms for capital and revenue projects, and if you contact us, we're able to provide the forms. Obviously, if you can let us know which form in particular you're after, we're able to give you that one, the one that you're after. So in terms of the 6 slides, the 6 tabs, we've got a little bit of information about what's on each one. It's fairly straightforward, so we'll try and I'll try and keep going through them fairly quickly. So if I have the next slide, Louise. We have sort of that tab A, the applicant info. So the you've got all the bits about the applicant, who they are, their contact details, things like that. I know Louise said earlier, and it's worth highlighting again, is the applicant needs to be the applicant name on the form needs to match the legal name of the organisation. So if it's a company, it needs to match the company house name. And it will go through all those sort of things there and contact details. So it's worth making sure that when you do it, if you can make sure it's the full company name on the application, that again means we don't come straight back to you asking a clarification. There's then a bit in tab B about project information. So again, it's got a bit about the heat network, the characteristics, and also regulatory parts. So any heat trust registrations, things like those bits there, we will ask if you have them, and if so, to provide numbers for the heat trust registration. And then sort of moving on, tab C is a bit of the project narrative. So it's the overview of the project and the funding request, the overview of the data, and it goes into a fair bit of detail around the objectives to try and make sure that what you're asking is going to meet those objectives of the schemes and also the suboptimal outcomes, to ensure we're meeting the scheme requirements. So then on tab D, with the baseline and targets. So again, these are about the data that were behind the project, and these are sort of some of the bits that, if you were successful, you may well, which will be carried over into M&R reporting, just to ensure that if you, whatever you're applying for, you need, you're making sure that we're hitting those targets. And then tab E is around the funding and procurement. So this is a bit about the grant requests. As Louise said, it's worth highlighting again, is it needs to be for capital up to, but not including 50% grant ask, and revenue ones can be 100% of the ask. And then finally, tab F is confirmation. So there's some supporting evidence that you'll need to provide to confirm that the organisation is happy to submit the application and agrees to the terms or agrees to the funding, basically, and declarations. So in terms of the supporting evidence, we've got here a list of the supporting evidence. Again, it is all in the guidance for applicants document, so you're able to go back and see it. And there's a bit of a checklist so you can see it for you submit in that guidance. But it's evidence around sort of costs for both of them. And then for capital grants, you've got evidence around your targeted benefits, so what you're trying to improve and the evidence around them. And then again, for both capital and revenue, we need these sort of signed letters confirming, and they're slightly different between the two, but mainly applicant support, acceptance for monitoring and reporting, and the confirmation. The confirmations at the bottom bullet point, and match funding if required for your project. And then if we're staying on the capital side, there's a sort of summary of programme works we require, and then where applicable, sort of the confirmation evidence of the eligibility of metering costs. Whereas the revenue one, we just need that sort of outline of the project programme. So if I come to the next slide, thank you. So with HNES, we do not intend to fund multiple applications by a single applicant where they are considered similar in terms of engineering, design, or operation. The idea is that you should be able to get your learnings from one and bring it across different projects or different heat networks. I know earlier we were talking about projects. So in terms of this, we're saying different heat networks. We're not intending to fund different heat networks from the same operators with the same sort of outcomes. We're hoping that it'll cascade across the learnings. And then, yeah, same with the optimization studies. Hopefully they will be able to cascade the information across different heat networks. So it's all about if they are similar heat networks. If they are completely different heat networks, then it is acceptable to put in more than one application because they are different functioning heat networks. So we've stressed it a couple of times as we've gone through, but from what came out of the round one application so far is for capital grants, it must be less than that 50%, so up to but not including 50% of the total project costs. And as we said, we'll come straight back to you if you put in 50% or greater. And then ensuring the name of the applicant matches a legal entity So if it's a company on Companies House, obviously if it's something like a local authority, the full local authority name, because we'll be doing those sort of background checks, we need it to match exactly. And then if you request irrecoverable VAT, making sure you're including justification as to why it is being claimed. So the application form, as you go through, will ask for costs excluding VAT, but there's a bit, if it's irrecoverable, you can add it in, but we need to ensure that there's a reason that you can't claim that back. So again, it just needs to be really clear, and ideally supporting evidence or something like that to show why you can't claim it back. And then if you're including contingency, it is best to put this in the other section on tab E. So it's one of the funding lines is other, if it can go in there to ensure it can be clearly identified when we're assessing them. So it's worth noting that you can request application forms. You can do that by emailing the email address that I've seen in the chat already, which is hnes@gemserve.com. The application form currently is being updated for round 2 and will be ready very, very shortly. It's minor changes. So there's a few boxes that we're aware of in the round 1 where you couldn't put things like zeros in, where projects needed to. So there's a few minor changes like that that are being made. However, we anticipate the form will be more or less the same for round 2 in terms of what it's asking, what it looks like. So you're able to start on the round 1 form, but if you are planning to apply for round 2, please make sure you get the round 2 form and submit on that round 2 form, as we're assessing round 2 applicants on that form only. But again, if you've already requested SharePoint sites or expression of interest, we'll make sure that we let people know once that round 2 form is available. So are there any questions so far on that first section?
Yes, Sam, we've been asked if we could provide a bit more information on what we're expecting to receive as evidence of targeted benefits. So I don't know whether Georgia might be able to pick that one up.
Yeah, happy to pick that up. So it can be for capital projects. It can be ideally like a report, for example, HNES demonstrator previous report that will be, or similar, a study that you have done that similarly address the suboptimal areas that you need improvements for, and for example, how much that can change the benefits versus the baseline. We will expect to see some calculations or some proof of calculation, how you have concluded those numbers. You can also like add as evidence, if relevant, of course, and if you have that like data that you have metered before or after doing a small improvement in one section of your network, which you want to replicate with HNES funding, that sort, like, for example, should be enough evidence for that. Hope that helps a bit.
I'll just jump in on that and say I think that the reason why we want to understand that is we want to make sure that the measure that you're putting forward, that there is some work that's been done prior to it coming forward to understand why that is the best option to go for and the actual impact that it's going to have on your project or on your heat network to improve its efficiency. We want to see that thinking has been done and what is the justification for choosing to make this change as opposed to another change. So what's the evidence, I guess, and what do you hope to achieve from implementing that particular measure or package of measures?
Thank you, Louise and Georgia. So I see a couple of other questions in the chat around one's when the round 2 form will be released. That
I can take
is
that one as well if you want.
I'll say incredibly shortly, but if you've got an exact date, Louise.
No, I don't have an exact date. It's something that we are working on currently. Hopefully within the next week or two. Obviously, we know that the deadline is the 19th of May, so obviously we're not going to leave it right to the last minute. But as Sam said, the actual changes to the application form, the majority are around things like validation and sort of providing additional guidance in terms of wording. So as we've said, if you do want to start compiling an application now, it will be possible to use the round 1 as a template and as a base to start from, but we will need it to be in the round 2 version when it is submitted. But yeah, we're not expecting to make wholesale changes to the application form. So yeah, if you want to see what questions you need to complete, you can refer to the round 1 form.
Thank you, Louise. And then there's another question around what is deemed as good evidence for recoverable VAT. So here you've asked about internal finance emails. That would be accepted with fair break, saying why it is irrecoverable. We need the justification, basically. So it's that detailed justification of why it's irrecoverable is the biggest part of that supporting evidence. I can see Louise, looks like you're about to jump in as well.
No, sorry, I was just reading another question.
Oh.
No, that's fine. Yeah. Again, it's just to understand why do you think that your VAT is irrecoverable? So what is the justification for that? So like you say, if your internal finance team has said that that's the case, obviously we can't just be like because our finance team told us. We have to understand their justification as to why they think that's the case. But yeah, something along those lines would be useful.
Thank you. I was just reading another question, and as you were speaking around with a different make of HIU in one building on a network to another, are individual studies acceptable as the findings will differ? Again, it might be best to talk to a relationship manager. Depends a little bit how big the network is, things like that. They probably would be all right. Would you agree, Louise?
Again, yeah, it depends. I mean, if it's simply that it's a, it depends how different the information, the HIUs are and the impact that has on the wider network. So I wouldn't like to say yes, they would both be, it would be worth doing 2 studies, or whether we'd fund both studies if they're not deemed significantly different. If the idea of the optimization study is to understand, I guess, the impact of switching out a particular, or to understand what's causing the inefficient elements of the heat network. So if there are significant differences between the 2 heat networks, then yes, that is something that we would be prepared to fund within one organisation if we can see that they are significantly different, and actually the findings from the first optimization study wouldn't be applicable to the second one. We're just conscious that the budget that we have for optimization studies isn't massive, and so we're keen wherever possible for organisations to take the learnings that they have from for 1 or 2, if they've got multiple heat networks, and take those learnings and apply them where applicable. But if this networks are significantly different, we're not saying only one organisation can only have one optimization study. If they are significantly different, then that's fine. You can apply for multiple optimization studies.
Thank you. Just looking at another question around what evidence would you need to provide to get funding for a consultant to carry out optimization studies? I know, Louise, you mentioned in the first part, obviously, that the data might not be there in heat networks, especially when they're older. So that is in there. We've obviously gone through the application form in general. The application form for revenue isn't as detail heavy maybe as a capital one in terms of metrics, things like that. It's a bit, you can have a bit more description around what we assess as well. So if you haven't got the data, obviously you can put that in sort of there's some text boxes, you can put that in there saying we haven't got that data for this reason, and that's part of why we don't know what's causing the heat network to be less efficient and why we need to carry out the study.
Yep,
but
happy to
it's
jump in
all,
on that one as well.
yeah.
So yeah, it's just in terms of the application form itself, we're looking at how poorly performing is the heat network, I guess, in terms of, and like I say, if you have a lack of data, then obviously that will require a bit more work from a consultant. You might not necessarily know why your heat network isn't working properly. It's to, if you have things like you've already spoken to consultants and you've got quotes, then that's helpful, but that's not mandatory. Again, a project plan to see when you plan to appoint a consultant, when your consultant is going to go to site, and how quickly they're going to carry out their optimization study, for example. All that kind of evidence is what's required for a revenue application. But again, the guidance for applicants document sets that out in a bit more detail. There's also a question from Sandra about what's the budget for optimization studies. The budget is £15,000 to £24,000 for revenue studies, and there's no budget for there's no minimum or maximum for capital grants.
Thank you. I'm just sort of conscious of time. I think the rest are more commentary sort of things rather than questions. So I'll move on. So in terms of submitting an application to HNES, prior to submitting it, obviously you need to request an application form. So we've said that already. If you're able to email hnes@gemserve.com, we'll provide the application form. We'll also ask some questions around what you're planning to submit. We won't hold you to whatever you put in that email, but it's to give us an idea of what is coming forward in that round and future funding rounds as well, so we're able to work out what's likely to be coming forward. So if you're able to give some sort of detail, obviously the more accurate the better. That helps us be able to manage the rounds. And if you'd like support from relationship manager, you can request that at the same time as the application form. Or if you've already got an application form or something like that, you're able to reach out directly to them at hnes.support@gemserve.com. And they will obviously be able to set up meetings with you to discuss your projects. And then finally, we've sort of said it already, but you've got expression of interests. And if you are planning to submit an application and haven't told us either via the email when you request your application pack and we send you back some bullet points, if you haven't completed that or been in touch with relationship manager, if you're able to submit an expression of interest to us via emailing hnes@gemserve.com. So on the next slide, submitting an application, we need them all submitted via SharePoint. You can then upload your application form and all the documents, and it's a secure place to upload them to, and means that we definitely receive them, whereas sometimes emails can get stuck if they're big. So they all need to come through that SharePoint space. And if you request a SharePoint space, these are the questions that we will ask you to set it up. So fairly standard: project name, organisation name, primary contact details, what sort of applicant type you are, the funding round you're applying in, the grant type, as well as the expected grant value and any additional users. Once you provide that, we'll be able to set the spaces up prior to the funding round deadline. If you can ideally do it as soon as possible, or ideally at the latest a week before the funding round closes, we want to have had all the spaces set up to ensure that you can access them successfully and upload successfully, and there's no issues on the final day. So moving on the next slide, each project will need a dedicated SharePoint space. So if you're going to submit for multiple projects, multiple heat networks, each one will need a separate space. So that's something you'll just need to make sure you tell us when we ask for the project names. You'll need to make sure that you tell us they're multiple ones, and we'll set those multiple spaces up. and as it's on SharePoint, which is Microsoft, if you should be able to access it straight away if you're already using Microsoft accounts, but if not, you'll just be asked to create a password to get in, and you may be asked to log in when you get, if you go in a later date. So please remember the password. All our clarifications are issued via your SharePoint space as well, so you will need to access it more than once. And it's worth saying, obviously, SharePoint, we will provide a little overview document as well, just in case people haven't used it before when you request a space. But making sure you're using the upload buttons or dragging and dropping into the folders. We have got a folder structure in there where we separate out the application form and supporting evidence. If you can make sure you drop the files into those relevant ones, that would be brilliant, as it helps us assess. And then something that is worth noting is please do not copy them directly from your company's SharePoint over to our SharePoint. It seems to cause corruption issues. So we recommend you download the documents onto your device and then upload them from there, as that seems to mean that they save correctly on SharePoint and we're able to open them. And then once you've finished, it's really important, please email hnes@gemserve.com. Let us know which project you're referring to, and that your files are ready to be assessed prior to the funding round closing. If you do not email us this, we will not be assessing your application. There's too many to go back and check one at a time, so only when we get a notification will we assess. And if you have any issues, it sounds really, really silly, but the amount of times it seems to fix it is completely closing the browser and completely reopening it. Seems to fix so many SharePoint issues. So please try that. And if you're still having issues, let us know as early as possible and we'll try and figure out what's going on and try and resolve it for you before the funding round closes. And then once you have submitted, we will be locking the SharePoint spaces in so that they we'll be reviewing them as the state they're uploaded. You can't make changes once the funding round has closed. Obviously, you'll need to make changes when we issue clarifications, and that will be dealt with at that point. So moving on, just a couple of bits. If you are uploading files, please make sure in an accessible format that we can open, and please try not to upload in zip folders because it makes it harder for us in terms of having to unzip them all. And if there's lots and lots of projects, that can take a long time. So please make sure you upload them ideally in not zipped folders. And when you're uploading your application form, please upload it with the original file name unchanged. You can add your project name at the start or end if you like, but that bit that is in there when we send it over, please do not change that, as it means that the assessment will take longer to start on your application. And then, as we said earlier, please can you try and make sure you upload files into the correct application form, into the application folder, and supporting evidence into supporting evidence folder. And as we've said, email us when you've uploaded it, and ideally if you can put the application number in the email, that really helps us. So that will be the main folder name's title, and it will start with HNES main. So that's all on sort of the how to submit an application from ourselves. Has anyone got any questions on that last section at all? I've seen there's been a few comments back and forth, but I think Louise has been answering them from what I can see.
I think Sam and I have been
yeah, there is
fine.
There is one that's specifically related to submitting an application. So if an application were submitted ahead of a deadline, would this bring forward the date of funding award, or would all applications in round 2 be notified at the same time?
Yeah, no, I was just in the middle of replying to that one. Yes, no, it obviously we're happy to accept applications ahead of the deadline, but obviously within the funding round, we need to assess everyone that applies in the funding round together. So no, an early submission wouldn't result in an early finding out of whether you've been successful or not, we assess all of the applications within the funding round at the same time.
Great, thank you. I think
Thank
the
you.
rest of them are all unrelated to submitting the applications.
Okay. I'm conscious of time. Obviously, we're at 3 o'clock. The next section was to talk through the assessment process. Obviously, as we heard, the slides will be available after this session. It was just to talk through the different areas around the scoring criteria and what we'd be looking at from an application. So two of the key things are around cost certainty and delivery certainty. So how much are we confident with the values that you put in terms of grant requests? So again, things like providing quotes and evidence of where the grant request number has come from is really helpful. And in terms of delivery certainty, project plans, again, evidence from contractors or things in terms of they're actually able to deliver at the time you've sent. We want to make sure again that the funding is spent within the financial year that it's applied, that it's been awarded to, and that the project ultimately can deliver what they've set out to do. Otherwise, we've awarded funding to projects at the sort of without where other projects might have been more suitable later on. So we really want to make sure that projects are able to deliver what they've said they're delivering. So any evidence you can provide to support that is very welcome. We're obviously looking to understand how the network is going to be improved. So things like reducing cost of heat, improving efficiency, reducing outages, savings to gas and electricity, all of that kind of information is really useful. And then obviously the quality of the supporting information to show the work that's happened before the application is really helpful. From a capital perspective, we want to understand on the project narrative how your project aligns with our objectives, particularly objectives 1 and 2 around carbon emission savings and improvement to customer detriment, and what's your approach to disseminating any information around the project to your customers, for example, so that they know what's going on. Value for money. So we want to make sure that obviously the money that is being spent on the capital improvements does actually result in reduction in carbon, reduction in gas savings, result in gas savings or electricity savings. So again, evidence around that is helpful. What level of data availability you have and baselining. As we say, we understand that a lot of projects may not have that information available, so we wouldn't necessarily penalise you for not having that, but it's useful to know if that is available. And from a revenue perspective, again, similar for the project narrative in terms of how it aligns with our objectives. We want to understand the cost certainty and the delivery certainty, and then the availability of data as well. In terms of timelines from an applicant's perspective, so weeks 1 to 6 following your submission are when we're undertaking our assessment process. Weeks 7 to 8 is when the outcomes of that assessment are then reviewed by the HNES investment committee, and that's when they will make the decisions on the funding awards. The final in week 9, there are then internal improvements within the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero to approve those recommendations for funding. And then from week 10 onwards, non-local authority applicants will find out if they're successful or unsuccessful, and the grant funding agreements will be issued. For local authority applicants, we need to go through further checks and approvals with the Treasury and DLUC. So it will be a few more weeks after that that the local authority applicants will find out if they're successful. But I know there was a question saying that it was sort of up to 14 weeks before you could find out if you're successful. If you're a non-local authority applicant, you should find out around week 10. Local authorities are more likely to be week 14. And from a clarification perspective, so within the assessment period, weeks 1 to 6, we may ask clarification questions about your project or about your application. So we really need people to be available during that time to be able to answer the clarifications that come out. if you do submit an application, we will inform you of when the clarification windows are, so that you can make sure that you're around for those, or someone within your organisation is around to be able to answer those questions, because any delay could result in could have an impact on your assessment essentially. I'm just going to move on to the pre-application support from Samantha, and then we'll have covered everything in terms of the areas of the event.
Thanks, Louise. This is just to reiterate that we're here to help you throughout the application process, and to answer any questions that you might have. So if you have an inquiry about HNES, about the scheme eligibility, would like to be added to our mailing list, or would like the application form, then please email hnes@gemserve.com. However, if you'd like to discuss your project in a bit more detail, we've had a few questions that are quite specific around individual projects, then please do reach out to our relationship managers, and they can set up one-to-one sessions with you to talk through the specifics of your individual project. I'd also like to really encourage everybody on the call to have a look at the application guidance document. I've sent through the link and I'll send it through again. A lot of the questions that have come through today are answered within the guidance document itself. Next slide, please. Just again to reiterate, our pre-application relationship managers can talk you through any issues within the application form, discuss your application. They can also have a review of your application and provide any high-level feedback, and answer any questions as you go through the submission process. So we're a little bit over time, but we're happy to stay online for a little bit longer if there are any questions that anybody has.
Yes, Emma.
Right, just coming in on a question that I placed in the chat, and it's only relevant for local authorities. So quite a specific one. Just, we're obviously basing our costs on the best estimates that we have at the time, but market rates fluctuate, they go up and they change. If we were to receive the funding up front and then actual costs over the course of the project turned out to be slightly lower than expected, what do we do with that underspend? Because you said you can't carry over between years.
Yeah, so that will be accounted for in your memorandum of understanding. So that's essentially your contract that you sign if you're awarded funding, and there's a section there about underspend and kind of clawback and all that kind of thing. So so that would be managed through the processes outlined in the memorandum of understanding. We can share that document with you.
So we just return any underspend?
Yeah, potentially. It depends, I guess, on how much of the underspend there is and that kind of thing. But yeah, there's a process outlined in the MOU as to how that would operate.
Okay, so it's not penalisation for
no.
I mean,
obviously,
exactly matching.
No, I mean, no. Obviously, it'll be very impressive if it did match to the number.
Yeah, exactly.
But I guess obviously with the capital project, it's up to 50%. So you would then think that if it was, what we don't want people is to massively overestimate. There has to be justification as to why you've come up with the numbers, and there is wording in our guidance document around contingency and inflation and things like that. So again, point you towards that document for that element. If we think that people have overinflated the costs just out of nervousness, I guess, or whatever, we do have the scope to partially award funding rather than full funding. If we think that, like I say, the justification isn't there as to why the figures have been put forward, and I guess that holds true for any costs that are put forward. If we don't think that they are reasonable costs, we might say, actually, yeah, we think your project is valuable, but market rates would suggest that it would cost this rather than that, so we're happy to award you this this amount rather than the full amount that you've requested. So yeah, but equally, like I say, it might be the case that there is an underspend. And yeah, like I say, I would point you to the memorandum of understanding for how that's handled. I can see there's another hand up, but I can't see whose it is.
So I think it's
exactly. Yeah, it's me.
yeah.
It's not a question necessarily. It's just to say thank you for taking the time out. This has quite been useful.
Oh, fantastic! Thank you.
A good exercise. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. That's nice to hear. And again, as I said, if you have any further questions or you want any more detail, the documents are there. If you have any specific questions, please feel free to email us or contact a relationship manager and we can give you further detail as well. It's probably worth saying at this stage, if you are looking to supply or to submit in round 2, the deadline is the 19th of May, but we would ask you to apply to let us know that you want to apply at least a week before that. So by the 12th of May, if you can request a SharePoint space, then we can make sure that's set up for you, and you can check that you're able to access the SharePoint space well ahead of the submission deadline. So yeah, so 12th of May for SharePoint spaces, 19th of May to submit your application for round 2.
Freddie.
Yeah, quick final question. I hope you don't mind answering. Do you have any general feedback from round 1 applications you might be able to share with us? So, for example, areas where all applicants were queried because they didn't fill in a part of the application right.
So yeah, so we've kind of hopefully tried to do that a bit through the slides that we've done. But again, just to reiterate, please do not request 50% of grant funding for capital projects because that will not be funded. It needs to be under 50%. Yeah, the full name of the applicant should be the full legal name. As Sam said, kind of what's listed on Companies House, for example, or the full name of the local authority, rather than just a kind of shortened version that you might refer to yourself as. They're the kind of 2 real main sort of clarifications that we went back to quite a few projects on. I'm trying to think now what else we put in the slides, but they're the 2 that spring to mind at the moment. But yeah, there are more in the slide deck.
Great, thanks everyone so much. We'll be distributing the slides and the recording alongside a feedback form tomorrow, so keep a lookout in your inboxes. Thanks everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.